Well, how about we jump into this? Looks like we've got a lot of people online and ready to go. Thank you again for joining this webinar on educating and developing Gen Z. This is a topic that touches a lot of us. I'm assuming all of us here on this webinar. And before we get into the panel discussion, we just want to give some background information on what the LX Consortium is and how this came to be. And so what you see in this space, we kind of did this landscape analysis, and on the university side, there's this real almost existential questioning going on. Who are we? What is our purpose? Is it to create knowledge, disseminate knowledge? Is it to give students skills? Is it vocational training? What are we? And so it's forced universities to ask a couple of questions. One is what is learning? And when knowledge becomes a commodity, it's very accessible to get knowledge about almost any topic these days. What does learning mean? And what does student success mean? And then how do you design around that? So some really big questions that universities are asking. On the corporate side, because of technology, people are saying, well, what does the future look like? How do we prepare when it's an unclear future? And so they're looking at technology and the pace of change. They're also asking questions like, well, what are the skills? What are the skills our current workforce needs? And then what are the skills that incoming employees need? And so that's kind of where we saw there's this nexus, the LX there in the middle, learning through experience. We believe that experience is kind of where these two worlds meet, and giving students real world experiences helps satisfy and helps answer some of these big questions. There are lots of groups and associations out there that touch on a lot of these topics, but we felt like underneath these big questions, there was a need to focus on learning by doing and understanding that impacts both universities and companies. And so last year, a few of us got together. You can see the list of schools. We got BYU and UT Dallas and Gonzaga and McMaster, Babson, and EduSourced, and Illinois, where I'm from. And we started asking, well, what would it take to put a group together? What should the group do? What are some of the topics? We had a fantastic grant from Procter & Gamble. They were interested in this topic and wanted this not just to live at one school, but kind of start some national conversations. And so that's kind of the background. And today for our webinar, we've got David and I will be hosting. David, do you want to introduce yourself and then?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm David from EduSourced. Looking at the list here, I know many of you are clients of ours, but many of you aren't and maybe haven't heard of us yet. The conversation with LX came out of discussions Andrew and I had a while back, and trying to remember how far back it's been. I'm actually not sure when we first started talking about it. But I know that as a company, we talk to schools across business and engineering disciplines about project-based learning, like Andrew just described. And we found that they're extremely similar operationally and how they structure project-based learning. Of course, the disciplines are different, learning outcomes are different, the specifics, but operationally just so similar. And so we would try to communicate that to people on calls. You hear from a school and you would explain, there's another school that's having the exact same challenge. Well, the questions I would get where I thought interesting, are they the same discipline? Are they ranked similarly to us? Those are the things schools seem to think about. And I think that probably is good for comparison and benchmarking generally, but when it comes to project-based learning, it just seemed a little bit different. So when Andrew and I would talk about, and the broader group of founding members too, how specific or general should this group be? It seemed like the right level was to combine folks who are involved with project-based learning and really actively thinking about career readiness, which is the ultimate goal, of course, but then to not really pay so much attention about, is it a large school, small school, is it engineering, or is it business? So that's kind of where we landed. And that discussion last year with those founding schools was really interesting. People, I think, found they had a lot more in common than not. And I know I learned a ton just as someone being able to be in the room and listen to folks. So looking forward to this session. And thanks to Andrew for doing a lot of the heavy lifting to help get this off the ground. We do view LX Consortium as an ongoing concern. So it's not just a one and done with this webinar. We're going to have additional webinars. Andrew will talk to you about that at the end. And we plan in-person summits again. So not just the limited group we did last year to get things started, but we're going to start opening this up too. So we hope that many of you will join and participate. Just quick background on EduSourced, and that's of course my company. We're the software platform for experiential project-based learning. Many of our clients, like I said, are on this webinar, and so thank you all for kind of bringing us on this journey and allowing us to be part of the community. But in a nutshell, EduSourced is designed as a software platform for your project-based learning and courses, and not to replace the educators or the staff that run these programs, but to give you a system and a framework no different than career service having systems for internships or a learning management system very broadly. This is meant to be a system and framework specific to project-based learning. So the goal for us has been less overhead, less manual effort, but to give you more information out on the back end, detailed records, learning outcomes, securely communicating between clients and teams and all of that. So that's the end of my sales pitch. If any of you have questions or want to know more, there will be a survey at the end. It'll ask you some other questions too, but you can let us know if you want us to get in touch and do a demo with EduSourced. Andrew, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, no, thanks, David. I think we were one of the first clients for EduSourced and still using
Officially
it now.
The first, actually. I should have mentioned that. Yeah.
Officially the first client. And as you see on there, I work at the Gies College of Business at the University of Illinois, and we've seen some huge changes here in the last few years. We've really embedded learning by doing into the student experience. We are launching the largest experiential learning course in the country. Starting this fall, we have hundreds and soon will be more than 1,000 students a year participating in projects with over 200 companies a year. And we just really believe this is the future of learning, and the value proposition that universities can bring has to be linked to giving these kind of real world experiences. So just to finish that conversation, the LX Consortium, so our goal is to bring together universities and employers who care about student success after graduation. And we specifically focus on this idea of learning by doing and project-based learning. Like David said, we'll have this webinar series that will focus on some of these topics. Will be broad and broadly relevant for many people in this space, and some will dive a little bit deeper into some of the more tactical topics. And you can see at the bottom here who we think is appropriate to join some of these webinars. So without further ado, this is the audience today. We had almost 200 people register for this webinar all over the US and many international outside the US locations. We have about 90 universities joining and about 30 companies, and in some cases many people from each of those companies and universities. So we're happy to have you. Let's just jump into the logistics. So we're going to do a panel discussion, and I'll be asking the panel members some questions. As I'm doing that, like David said, we'd love for you to chime in. We want you to feel like you're sitting in the room with us. So on the Q&A button on the Zoom bar, we hope that you will submit some questions for the panel members while we talk. That way we make this kind of real time and live, and we'll pause to answer questions throughout. And then after the panel discussion, if your question didn't really fit that discussion, we'll have some time for general Q&A. We will probably poll you every once in a while throughout. We do want to start with one question, so we invite you to go to the chat and write on there why you joined this webinar today and what you're hoping to get out of that. And we'll try to touch on that throughout the discussion. So go to the chat icon and put in why you joined and what you're hoping to get from this. So without further ado, I'm going to have our panelists introduce themselves, and our first question is, what brought you here? Why are you sitting on this panel with us today? We'll just go in order of what we see on the screen. So we'll start with you, Devki.
All right, so my name's Devki. Like it says on the screen, I'm currently a student here at Gies, studying finance and IT. Andrew actually brought me here to this panel. So he was saying that there was this panel. I took his class last year, which was an action learning class. And he told me about this panel. And then he said, actually, we're looking for some Gen Z representation within this panel. And I'm really excited to give that perspective as a student because I know when I was going through Andrew's class, he had implemented a lot of changes. It was a different action learning class than any project-based class I'd taken before. So yeah, that's the perspective that I'm excited to give here today.
Thanks, Devki. We're excited to have a real live Gen Z, the person with us on the call. Samir?
Hi, everyone. My name is Samir Desai. I lead learning and organization development for Northwestern University. So in that role, I'm actually responsible for the learning and development of the folks who work at the university, the staff and faculty who support our students. I'm also an adjunct faculty member at the School of Education and Social Policy, where I teach in a master's program to actual students, to the students themselves. And I've been in this profession for about 30 years overall, with a strong background in digital learning, and really always thinking about how do we design and deliver learning experiences where our people, our participants get the maximum out of it, and that they can apply that, especially as they enter and continue in their workforce careers. And so this generation has its own unique requirements and challenges, just like every other generation or other types of individuals and cultures do. And that's why this is interesting to me and one that I'm excited about talking about today.
Thanks, Samir. I know we'll be asking you questions both on the corporate perspective and the academic perspective, so we're glad to have you here. Rachel?
Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel Reiser. I'm the Assistant Dean for Undergraduate Student Services and Experience at the Questrom School of Business at Boston University. In that role, I work with a team that provides academic and career advising to students. That's a primary role in my job, but I certainly do a lot of other work as well with the faculty and the curriculum and so forth. My presence on today's panel has a lot more to do with the other aspect of my work. I'm a generational researcher and consultant, and I have written and presented and worked with companies and organizations really around the multi-generational workplace and how we integrate new generations into these environments.
Yeah, fantastic, Rachel. We'll be asking you questions from both of those perspectives as well. Robert?
So again, thanks for the opportunity to be a part of this. So yeah, my name is Robert Hart. I'm a member of the mechanical engineering faculty here at UT Dallas. I've been here teaching our capstone engineering course in mechanical engineering for 8 years. And so, you know, for those of you who may not come from an engineering background or from an engineering department, one of the things our students have to do before they graduate is complete a capstone project. And here we do that as it's a 2-semester project. And the idea is that we do mostly corporate sponsored projects. So students manage a real world engineering project completely from start to finish. So in that sense, it's really kind of the ultimate project-based learning experience for them. So what we teach them in class is not new technical things, but more about how to bridge the gap between being a student and being a professional. So we teach a lot of professional skills, project management, other things that students need to really succeed in managing their first big project. So, you know, this topic is really kind of crucial for me and for those of us, you know, teaching in the capstone space. You know, technical classes, the things that, you know, that we teach, you know, our sophomores and juniors, you know, that's one part of it. But, you know, the other thing our engineers really need is real world experience learning, the practice of engineering. And that's what we teach. And so, you know, learning to connect with our students is really critical. So that's one reason I'm really happy to be a part of this.
Well, as you can see, we've got a fantastic panel. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can just see faces here. And we can dive into these questions. And as we mentioned, please post some questions. We've seen a lot of your responses to my first question, so we'll address some of those as we go. But as we go through these through the panel discussion, feel free to ask some questions on the chat or the Q&A function, and David will chime in and make this kind of an all-around discussion. So let's set the stage here, Rachel, with you, and asking what is Gen Z? If you can give us kind of a visual, right, or a profile. What is Gen Z?
Sure. I'm very excited to be here as well, so thank you for involving me. I think a great place to start is who are they, right? So when we define any generation, the birth span is critical. Birth spans really depend upon which researcher you're following. The Pew Foundation has identified Gen Z as beginning with the year 1997 and is not defined as yet the ending year. Other researchers might call the starting year around 2002. But by any measure, we are now seeing Gen Z in our college classrooms and, in fact, starting to enter the workplace. A little bit more about them. As of last year, Gen Z was believed to comprise about 32% of the world population. In the United States, they are already the most diverse generation thus far. About 48% of Gen Z are racial or ethnic minorities. They're really, in a lot of ways, being shaped by immigration patterns. So it's important to know that immigration flow into the United States peaked in the 1990s, but we're still very high in the 2000s. With Generation Z, we're seeing fewer foreign-born Gen Z youth than we saw of millennials at the same stage of life, but a significantly higher number of Gen Z who were born in the United States to immigrant parents. Also relevant to what we're talking about today, at college age, Gen Zers are more likely to be in college than in the workforce than any generation that preceded them. I also think it's important when we talk about the generations to think about other aspects of who they are. So for example, there is a tremendous amount of entrepreneurial spirit to Generation Z. And I'm going to share some data points from different surveys while I mention some of this stuff. So for example, from one survey, they found that about 75% of teens wanted to translate their personal hobbies and passions into full-time jobs down the road. 72% wanted to own or start a business someday. They also come in with a really global and diverse mindset. We see that Gen Z is moving toward adulthood with more liberal attitudes and a greater openness to emerging trends, things like gay marriage and gender identity. They tend to define themselves as experimenting with different ways of being oneself. They call themselves identity nomads. And I'm quoting here when I say, we each have our own style and way of being. But what binds us is that we accept and understand everyone's styles. So I think that reflects their desire to have greater inclusivity and openness to different points of view. I think particularly for this webinar, understanding how they learn is quite critical. Engaged and active learning is more technology-based than ever, and that's a great way to reach them. From a survey in 2018, 81% of the students surveyed use do-it-yourself learning platforms in order to enhance or augment their learning. 79% desire game-based learning systems, and a lot of them use user-generated social media as a critical learning tool. Obviously, technology is a huge part of who they are. If we thought that millennials were the original digital natives, Gen Z has kicked it up a notch or 1,000 notches. They certainly are the first generation to have never known a world without the internet. And as a result, they view the digital and physical world really as one. They have a heavy reliance on a high technology and highly networked world, and that makes them accustomed to have this constant proliferation of information that is both coming at them but also readily accessible to them on demand. Here's a few fun facts. Depending upon some data points, they spend an average of 2 hours and 52 minutes a day, 2 hours and 52 minutes a day on just social networks and messaging services, never mind other uses of the internet. 55% have said they can't go more than 5 hours without internet access before becoming uncomfortable. 27% saying they become uncomfortable if it's more than an hour. We see that in the United States, 45% of Gen Zers receive a mobile service plan between the ages of 10 and 12. 91% by one survey have their digital devices in bed with them in the evening. 60% agree that they're more insecure without their phone than their wallet. I think we have to recognize that for many, their phone is a wallet, right? It gets funnier though. 40% say working Wi-Fi is more important to them than working bathrooms. 32% would rather go 3 days without a shower than go a week without a phone. So this is just a little bit to illustrate some of this outlook and really to underscore the fact that they expect technology that is not clunky or outdated. More than 60% of Gen Z and millennials as well will opt out of an app or a website or an online experience if it's too slow to load, it's not easy to navigate, if it doesn't sort of keep their digital interest. We'd be missing an important feature, and I believe tied to some of this ties to technology, if we didn't mention that mental health issues, emotional and psychiatric issues are rising in importance. And 70% say that anxiety or depression is a major problem, and another 26% say it's a minor problem. That leaves a mere 4% that say it's not a problem. And again, that's from one data point, but there's a ton of research that underscores that. Really, the final thing I'd want to touch on is, and this is sort of central to the work that I do around the multi-generational environment, particularly the workplace. It's important to talk a little bit about this us versus them perspective. I think underscored by a few months ago, we all saw sort of the initial wave of the okay boomer stuff, right? There is a lot of data that talks about how this generation and a little bit the millennials who preceded them are less well off than members of earlier generations. Lower earnings, fewer assets, less wealth. There was a 2016 research by economists at Stanford that found that people born in the 1980s had a 50% chance of out-earning their parents, whereas those born in the 1950s had a 79% chance of out-earning their parents. And we know that 75% of Gen Z members anticipate working harder than previous generations did. In fact, a survey by Accenture from 2017 indicated that almost 90% of class of 2017 graduates chose a major with job availability in mind. So we've got to remember this in the context of things like college tuition has increased actually nearly 1,400% since 1978. That's more than 4 times the rate of overall inflation, according to the Labor Department. Student loan debt has quadrupled since the start of 2005. It's at nearly 1.5 trillion. That's rising faster than any other form of household credit over that period. People are essentially earning less. When adjusted for inflation, we see that overall wage stagnation has decreased the purchasing power for most Gen Zers. And I'm sorry to say all of this, especially to you, Devki.
Rachel, let me
Yeah,
just jump in. This is sets such a great stage. And as you were sharing some of those statistics, I was watching Devki's reactions. So Devki, I want to ask you, and there was a lot to respond there, but were there some things that you thought that Rachel said resonated with you? You said, oh yeah, that's me, or that's my generation. And were there some things you thought, I don't know if that is true for you and your experience?
Yeah, most of that I would say is very accurate. Even the fun fact about not wanting to go a long time without Wi-Fi on your phone. And then I thought, and I was like, yeah, I would definitely want Wi-Fi over probably everything. But I kind of think what it boils down to is that in the classroom, the reason that we're so driven by technology and we want to be able to apply what we learn is that data and knowledge is kind of becoming everyone's, as opposed to, I think in the past it was if you studied hard and you went to the right classes and you took the right steps, you would have the knowledge to then apply in your job. And now a lot of that information is readily available online or through a few classes online. I know Coursera and Data Camp are becoming huge platforms age to just pick up those skills that you might need in the workforce. And so for us to be competitive, it just comes down to how do you apply that in a unique way, or what effective edge are you bringing? We hope that we can apply that in the classroom to then bring that into the workforce. And I think that's why technology plays such a big role, because we want to be able to use the tools that we'll then be able to use when we do graduate, as opposed to just learning the theory in class. And again, I think people are very driven by this idea of entrepreneurship and creating something new that aligns with their passions. And so it's less about what job am I going to have, but rather how can I use all of these skills that I've learned in college to create the job for myself. And I've seen that mentality in so many of my peers. And that's really why I guess, not really the older way, but the lecture-based kind of, I'm going to lecture you. And then
You can call it old. You can call it old.
I don't want to call it old because it still happens, and it's effective for some subjects, but for those skills that you need to apply, like maybe coding or in business, a lot of that analytical side of it that I've been learning, it's hard to just learn and then regurgitate if you never apply. And that's where I hope the world will kind of go towards, because if I know how to apply it, then I can look up the information to fill the gaps. And I think that kind of filters into attention span a little bit, because time is so valuable nowadays. I know people, my peers who college, even though they're a full-time student, is only part of their lives. They're working many jobs. They're in a lot of organizations that are helping them align with their future goals. And so if that hour and a half, 2 hours of your day is not spent on something that's engaging and really pulling your time for the amount of tuition that you pay, like Rachel said, that kind of puts a damper in the interest. So keeping that interest high and making sure that that time is worthwhile is really, I think, what my peers and I are really looking for in the classroom setting, definitely.
Well, this is fantastic. This is why we have you here, Devki, so we can hear your perspective and experience, and we'll come back to you in a minute. I want to jump to Samir. Thinking about this, if you put your Accenture hat on, the corporate hat on, as you think about, there's multiple generations in the workplace, and someone actually asked, a question about mixing multiple generations. But when you see these younger generations coming into the workplace, did Accenture overhaul your learning and development? Did you totally change how training worked and how mentoring worked? I mean, what were you thinking within the company? What were some of the discussions, and what were some of the changes that you made on the corporate side?
Yeah, really interesting so far. And from my experience at Accenture, before I came to Northwestern University, I was there for about 25 years. And I started out in engineering and computer science and did a lot of digital-based learning early on in my career, moving then to other aspects of learning and talent development. And certainly saw a lot of changes over those 25 years, many different factors, not just generational, leading to that, certainly technology advances and other changes as well. It's interesting, as I listen to Rachel and Devki, I can't help but just picture my daughter in that where she's using when she's studying, she's using videos seamlessly with her friends and using 2 different devices and doing TikTok videos, which I've had the pleasure of doing with her in 30-second segments, and that's how they communicate and learn. And I have to say, to be honest, it's not so different than maybe how I am and maybe others in our generation are, where if you asked us, could you go without Wi-Fi for 3 days? I'm not sure many of us could say yes to that anymore either. Because so much of our work and our consumer life, it works through Wi-Fi and digital devices. And so as this emerged at Accenture from a corporate standpoint, a work standpoint, especially in the services industry, really, really important in my role of managing director overall for talent development globally, to really think about how do our people learn, but not just learn, but how do they apply what they learn? Because in the end, in a corporate environment, the end goal is not learning, it's about business outcome. And the business outcome, some changes in behaviors or improvements in skill that allow that business behavior or the business outcomes to be achieved. And so while there's something inherent, obviously, from a growth standpoint that we want people to learn, ultimately, it's the intersection of what we want from a business standpoint. We're looking for certain outcomes, and what that individual wants as an employee, who thinks of themselves less and less as an employee, if you will, right, of what they want from their experience, both on the job and from their learning experiences. And if you looked at that intersection point between the two, and the continued pressures around cost and driving down the cost of training experiences or pulling people away from work, it was interesting in that our people, especially the younger generation, were asking for the same types of things. I don't want to go to something lecture-based, as you said, for 5 days out in St. Charles, Illinois, to learn about something that may or may not be applicable to the work I'm doing right now. I want something to help me figure out what I need to learn today to be able to apply in my client site tomorrow. At the same time, the ways in which our people were expecting to receive that learning or experience it was much more in line with what they experienced in the consumer world, right? The consumer experience, and much more of a blurring of lines, where it used to be that people were tolerant of the fact that in the consumer world, I could use my laptop and use Amazon or Google, and internally it would be kind of clunky, and that's a work environment. People don't have that kind of patience anymore, and the newer generation certainly don't. They expect the consumer experience in the work environment, and we're still trying to catch up with that. So as we looked at this intersection point, I would say it was more incremental than like revolutionary. We didn't wake up one day and say, we've got Gen Z here, we've got to crank the wheel and completely transform how we train our folks. But it was incremental, and in that process became pretty transformational. So let me give an example of this. We had our enterprise was about 300,000 people at the time, so about 6-7 years ago maybe, and working with our lead in India, which 100,000 of our employees were in India. So kind of looking at the global landscape, average age of the individuals there was around 25, right, which is a very young population. And when when we were talking to him about it, he said, our people don't, when they want to learn something, they just Google it, right? So big data, I'm going to go Google it. He said the problem with that is that not only do we not know what they're getting in return, is it the best stuff out there, but also is it the stuff that's applicable to Accenture and the work we do, our methodologies, our way of doing things. So our challenge was, how do we bring the simplicity of searching for Google and watching things on video to internal learning experience, and created a capability which we call learning boards, which is curated learning in partnership with internal subject matter experts with really light learning design to identify like the top 10 or 12 internal and external videos, websites, documents that individuals could see with the name of the subject matter expert that they could follow up on with questions, and a social channel where they could ask questions or have dialogues with peers or with other subject matter experts, or even provide their own content. And in just a period of 2 years, we rolled out over 500 of these globally, and it continues to grow. And that really is indicative of the type of learning experience that's becoming more and more prevalent in the corporate environment, and balancing that when we do bring people together, we want to maximize the impact of that experience through the networking and social aspects of it, not just the formal learning that happens in the classroom.
That's, it's interesting, some of the changes. So what I heard, some of it, a lot of a short form training, right? Instead of a 5-day on-site, drink from the fire hose, so to speak. It's make it whatever I need right now, and make sure it's not too long. That was one of the things that I think I heard from you. Another was having content available, easy to find, easily searchable. But it sounds like Accenture wasn't actually creating all the content; it was just curating, because as Devki was alluding to, there's so much out there already. That knowledge is a commodity these days. So it was mostly curating that content. Is that right, Samir?
Yeah, very much so. And the distinguishing factor from a corporate standpoint is was the context. So the content is really available. It's how and why and when we should be using it. Those kind of questions became more the domain of us as the employer to teach. And the learning design typically had been, how do you mix that together, right? And more we were moving to a model, and continue to be, where, this generation is so great at connecting different content together, quickly assimilating disparate amounts of information, like really awesome and amazing at it, that what we found is we didn't have to combine it together. They could do that. We can provide the content and overlay, or in addition, provide the context. So have the curated content, provide the context, and they will be off and running with it.
I want to jump in really quick with a question from the audience. And I'm noticing in the chat that it looks like it's set. So whenever people chat us, you all as attendees can't see what one another is saying. So there's a lot of stuff here. So we'll try to get to as much of it as we can. Samir, I think you touched on this a little bit, but maybe you could expound on it. Is the trend on learning by doing due to the differences in Gen Z, or are there other factors? I know you're not just talking about learning by doing, but of course, technology is always an element, but as you've observed education change from two different lenses over the past many years, what's your view of that?
Yeah, I mean, all the panelists here would probably agree that, learn by doing or experiential learning has been a trend for various reasons. So certainly it's not just for the current generation. I think more and more the need for applied learning and to move from a learning experience to performance faster are both drivers, regardless of the generation that's participated in the learning experience has been pushing that. In the master's program that I teach in, when we teach for example, 3 hours in an evening program, and these are folks between maybe the age of 25 and 30, so maybe a little bit older than a Gen Z population, but we spend maybe 15 minutes on a lecture, and the rest of it is more on project and interactive work, applying it to either their projects or some sort of project structure we set up internally. In the corporate environment, that's very similar as well.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it sounds like a recurring theme. The information is not the problem, and finding information isn't really the problem. It's applying it in the right context, in the right way, seems to be the skill that we're trying to teach employees, and probably true on the academic side. And I think this is a good segue to Robert. There's a question from the audience. So I'm going to read some of this. So commenting on Samir's comments that some of these changes are fantastic in the corporate environment, but the pace of change is so fast that universities can't fully deliver that, maybe can't move as fast, which is probably true. Makes you wonder if the university model needs to shift away from teaching history to teaching or facilitating learning in deep thinking and problem solving and DIY learning or knowledge curation. So any thoughts on that, Robert? And then we'll follow up with another question for you.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that's probably, somewhat dependent on what your area is. And I can speak, for engineering only, but, engineering, the fundamentals are really critical. And, I tell students a lot of times it's like learning a musical instrument or playing a sport, right? You've got to practice the fundamentals. So that you're ready, on game day or recital day to perform. And so, I don't think things like, the basic classes that we teach are going to go away. I think we can teach those things better, and experiential learning is certainly one way to do that. But I did want to add that I think, while this discussion always kind of has this undertone that when you start talking about generations, that there's some bad part of this and something is wrong and something needs fixed. And I thought about this, and there is actually a lot of good things that that we can think about. And one that certainly comes to mind is we can ask a lot more of our students today than we probably could even 10 or certainly 20 years ago. And you think about even something as simple as doing a literature review. I mean, that used to be a major undertaking. You had to you go to the library and you had to haul journals to the photocopier, and that was a huge thing. And now it's something you can do at your desktop in a matter of minutes. So students can have a much richer experience now, because some of these things are so easy. Another thing we've seen is availability of components and electronic components that our students can use to learn at such low cost and so easily. So things, there's companies out there, and if a student needs to make a pulse oximeter, they can go and they buy the circuit board, they plug it in, and in an hour or two they've got it working. And that's something that would have probably, even building that would have been beyond the capabilities of any student project just a decade ago. So students now have an ability to innovate, create, and make things like they've never been able to before, because all of this, all these things are so readily available, not only, low cost, but things, repositories of code online, 3D printing. We've got students now that regularly do, projects involving machine learning. I mean, all of that's, these are seniors that are doing that. But that comes with some, with some challenges, and some of the things Devki said, I think really line up really nicely with some of the things that, I've been thinking about as in preparing for this. And certainly all that information is out there. The question is validity. How do we teach students what information is reliable and correct and what's not. And I'll give you a good example. Just happened last week. I'm working with a student design team right now that's building a pressure vessel. And in the course of working on this, they decided to switch from one material to a different material, similar material. And so I said, well, how do the material properties compare? And so, somebody on the team pulled their laptop open, they Googled real quick, and they said, well, the yield strength is this. And I said, this is a pressure vessel. We're going to put 10,000 PSI in. It's got the capability to kill somebody if it fails. Are you confident that number you Googled is right? And so that's the issue. I mean, all this information is available, but is it right? Is it reliable, when health and safety are on the line? In the same, we run across the same thing. There's so much information. A student needs to buy a motor, and they go out and they Google, and they get 500 companies selling motors. Which ones of those are reliable? Which ones are going to give them the information they need and support them? And so that's something that we really do struggle with.
Robert, while we're still here, kind of talking about academia, do you want to share any things maybe that you've changed over the years in terms of delivery of your courses? There were a lot of comments when we asked the question, why are people here listening to this webinar? A lot of comments were, well, I want to know how to better connect with Gen Z. I want to better teach, better enhance the classroom experience. Any things you've learned that you said, oh, I'm really glad I made this change, or made this, or it's had some kind of impact for the students?
Yeah, absolutely. The way the class looks today is nothing like it looked 8 years ago. 8 years ago, it was 90 minutes of me talking from PowerPoint slides. And you quickly get, of course, that was my first experience at a university, and you quickly learn that's not going to resonate with students. And the literature tells us that's not how, that's not the best learning experience. So today our lecture content is much more put in these 10 to 15 minute modules, and we have a lot more interactive things. So we use classroom polling, for example. So we will stop, we'll introduce a topic, and then we'll stop. Everybody will go through a series of questions or scenarios, and everybody responds. So those kind of things have been a really nice addition. We use a lot more video content in class now. So instead of me, necessarily showing how to do a particular thing, there's some really great, this idea of, there's really great content already out there. All you got to do is connect to it. So we do, some of those kind of things as well. But it is much more, it is much less of me talking and much more active learning now.
That's fantastic. Devki, I want to jump back to you. How do you like to learn? What, if you could teach us all or give us some suggestions, what have you seen that works well, or what do you wish the classroom or learning experience was like?
Yeah, so of course, everyone learns in a different way. But for me personally, it's not so much about how the content is delivered, more about, do I know what the end goal is? So I really enjoy when professors will take maybe a couple days at the beginning of the semester to say, this is what I'm going to teach for this end goal. So I had like a wealth management class last semester, and the professor said, I'm just going to touch on various buckets of wealth management, but the end goal is not to be an expert. Like, you can't leave this class and give people solid wealth management advice. But I'm going to touch on these things, and hopefully at the end of the class, you'll know if you're interested in this field and what to look into more. And that kind of set the tone for the entire class. And I remember taking your action learning class, where the first week or so was spent on making a team charter, where you would be able to figure out, what are we going to deliver for the client? What are we capable of? And what's the end goal? And I think having that structure really sets a good plan for the entire semester, year, however long the class is. And then the information can be added in to fit those learning objectives and those goals. But having that clear-cut idea of what's going to happen really helps me at least focus on things like as the class progresses. Another thing, and I agree with what everyone on the panel has said so far, but technology is very it's a very large part of my learning experience so far. I really like when professors will take the time to find those videos and then show them in class, or use some polling mechanisms. So here at U of I, we have iClickers. And just like halfway through class, there'll be a question on the screen and you can just vote, like, are you following the material? Do I need to go over anything? And the professor can gain some sort of holistic view of whether or not something needs to be rehashed, or if people are still following the material. And kind of going off of EduSourced, we had this platform for your action learning class, and it also just made things like online based. You would be able to see the checkpoints, made communication a lot easier. And I think moving towards, like, at least personally, those online platforms just make it a lot easier for that communication and interaction to happen. Another thing that professors have started doing that I've noticed is open exams or open quizzes, where any of the information that you've learned up to that point in the lecture, or whatever you can bring from home on a sheet of paper, a couple sheets of paper, can be used on that exam. And it's not so much like who retains more of the information, but in that testing scenario, who can apply the information properly to solve the problem. And those skills have been more commonly emphasized: critical thinking, time management, understanding the objectives, and setting goals. And I think that it doesn't matter what subject you're learning, but those skills are kind of necessary if you want to be able to apply them correctly. I saw that in my internship too. It wasn't who has the most information to apply, but who's finding the correct information and who's applying it, and who's able to kind of maneuver through any problems that you face and apply whatever information in the correct way. So that's how I like to learn. But I don't want to say anything bad about the lecture format. I will say, like, there are some subjects in some classes where that's really the only way to go. And then maybe adding in those like really minute changes of iClickers, or some open discussion about what you've been learning or something like that helps. It's not like the entire thing has to be overhauled and put online, and sometimes those little tweaks mean the most.
And Andrew, I just opened a poll. I don't know if you saw it, but that's our question we were asking to the employers. And I forgot to mention at the beginning, I think Andrew suggested it, but this group is really organized around including employers too, and not just higher ed institutions, since employers are a key part of career prep. Question for the employers joining us today was, are you making changes to training and learning and development because of differences in the younger generation? And 70% said yes. 30% said not yet, but we're planning to as Gen Z matriculates. 0% said no. I thought we were going to get a lot more of that middle response, to be honest, since Gen Z is just now entering the workforce. So really stunning to me that over 2/3 of these folks are already making changes, perhaps correlating with what Rachel and Devki have already told us.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's interesting to listen to Devki. I actually teach a class this afternoon, Devki, and you're making me rethink what my plan is just for today to implement some of the ideas that you and Robert were talking about. And same with Samir, some of the ideas you shared from the corporate perspective, I think should give us some insights on the academic perspective. I've got a couple of questions that I want to move through. Think of these as like lightning round questions, our panelist members. One came from the audience, which I think it's probably a big hole that we could jump into, but let's just touch on this. Here's the question, and I'm going to frame this in a bigger question. The question is, does cell phone participation just allow anonymity? Shouldn't we encourage people to speak up? And so, with technology and polling and using these kinds of apps and social media, there's a lot of this anonymity. And you see problems in society when it comes to civil discourse and things like that. And so can we teach young people to disagree respectfully, or just have kind of open conversations in the classroom? So I'll take this to Rachel. And this also, I'm going to throw in one more question, which came from the audience, which is about intergenerational, multiple generations reacting or interacting together. So if you think about those two things, putting multiple generations in the same room, and then this idea of kind of how do we have normal, productive conversations and still use technology in good ways?
So, I mean, I think it would be foolish to say, no, that's meaningless. The idea that anonymity is introduced by some of these social media platforms and other forms of technology. Of course it does, and for Gen Z and for others. It's not. I think Samir spoke earlier about. It's not just about Gen Z, particularly as it comes to technology. We all have evolved into this sort of uber technological society. I think the difference for Gen Z is truly, their upbringing as digital natives with this ingrained, acculturated experience that becomes much sort of deeper set and has a set of implications that a digital immigrant such as myself perhaps don't face. The anonymity question, and then sort of weaving that into the concept of how the generations are conflating together into, in particular, our workplace environments, but certainly also in higher education, we're a multi-generational environment as well. That is all true. But notwithstanding that, we know that Gen Z feels that communication face-to-face is among their top concerns in the workplace environments they're going to. 72% say that, and say that the most important factors about their decisions as to where to work are a supportive leadership and positive relationships at work. So they are not just looking to use technology as an opportunity to disengage. And I just will say, as we talk about these diverse environments, I think Gen Z brings leadership in ways, and this speaks to some of what Robert was speaking of, about let's not just look at the challenges of any new generation. Gen Z is leaders in both our academic and our workplace environments. As we look at what are we educating our students for, what's the world we're educating for, we don't fully understand what that is. And I actually think today's students have a better sense of what's coming in many ways than previous generations do. They certainly are very devoted to the notion of diverse environments. They are interested in environments that have diverse composition of coworkers. They're making decisions about where to work based on the company's dedication to diversity across all spheres, not just racial and ethnic. So that interpersonal piece is of critical concern to them, and they are really leaders on that front. I don't know if that gets at some of what you're asking about, Andrew.
Yeah, that really helps. It dovetails into one of the audience questions and a statistic that I found as well. So let me jump to this question. It says, we are talking about what is likely to change as Gen Z enters the workforce, but what could we perhaps anticipate will remain the same? And you mentioned human relations, and I'm going to call it soft skills. The statistic I found that majority of Gen Z are more confident that they have tech skills than the non-tech skills. So they're worried that they don't have the soft skills or the non-tech skills. So Samir, maybe you could talk about that both from the corporate and the academic side. Are there things that you've learned from your experience at Accenture about helping young people develop soft skills, team working, conflict resolution, leadership, and can we apply that to the academic?
Yeah, I mean, it's, actually, I was just about to answer one of the questions out there around kind of the existential questions that relates to this as well, which is that, in a corporate environment, for the most part, we felt we could teach the technical skills, or people would learn it on the job, right? And it's those, what we might call softer skills or life skills, or that are much harder to do so, and where it was always a challenge, right? How do you help someone figure out how to relate to somebody else, how to communicate more effectively, there's more and more of an expectation that higher education is addressing those needs, right? As students are coming out of college, that they have some of these life skills or soft skills necessary to work in more and more diverse environments, more and more global environments. And so, one of the places that I see that happening in higher ed, actually that might be a little bit ahead of the corporate space that higher ed can help with, is a point that Rachel raised around the younger generation being much more aware of the diversity of the folks that they work with, expecting diversity learning those, learning to be woke, both in terms of what we cover as content in the programs that we have, but also in terms of the faculty and how they think about diversity and identity in the classroom and power dynamics. And I think that can really help and translate into the corporate world as we move forward. But it does challenge us in the higher ed space. And coming to higher ed, I found that those types of challenges or issues and are much more prevalent and addressed much more head on, right? So the fact that as a faculty member to be much more aware of different identities, to think about things like pronouns and to think about how people want to be referred to themselves, those are becoming more important in the workplace. And I think higher ed continue to work on that as well. Another area, example, is in the master's program that I teach in. We don't talk about learning objectives in the traditional way, like I will be able to do this, or I will know this coming out of this, or explain this. We talk about it from a standpoint of I used to think, now I think. So I used to think this about how people learn that's their program, and now I think this, or now I believe this, because that type of transformation to thinking patterns and how people discern information and analyze information is much more important than I know the technologies for social learning, which is going to change anyway down the road, right? So I think those types of skills, higher ed in partnership with corporations, where I think traditionally it's focused on the technical skills and the pathways around that. This idea of focusing on some of these life skills, I think is really interesting for us to think more about, because I think higher ed could really help with that.
Before we go any further, if I could, we're close to the end of the hour. Our plan is to stay a little bit later and try to answer some of these questions. You guys have given us some really great content to think about. We want to get to as much of it as we can. I'm going to go ahead and launch an exit survey that you can complete kind of at your leisure. But I just want you to know we're not ending this session. I'm just simply putting that up now.
Yeah, and I'll make just a couple of comments too. As we close this out, the panel is happy to stay on a few more minutes for those that can, those that need to head off to another meeting. We just want to thank you for joining us. We would love to stay in touch. We'll be doing more of these webinars touching on topics like these that are pretty broadly applicable and relevant to all of us. You can go to our website, lxconsortium.org, here at the bottom of the screen. It's still being built, but you can put in your email so that we can stay in touch and let you know about future webinars. We would love your ideas for topics for other webinars that impact this nexus of employers and universities. You can add some of those suggestions to the chat box right now. And we also have other opportunities to work together. So if you're interested in doing, for example, joint projects, we've got a big company we're working with right now. I know that we'd love to do some joint research with other universities. And if you want to learn more about EduSourced, like David said, there's more opportunities for that. We will share the recording of this webinar on our website. And there are a ton of questions that we haven't been able to address. And so we plan to post kind of a text, put up a blog basically, and answer some of these questions in text form up on the website. So all of that is coming up. We'd love to stay in touch. And thank you again for joining us today. I'm going to put up here on the screen the email addresses of the panel members in case you want to contact them directly. So I'll leave this up for a second so you can capture those. And then we'll jump back into one or two more questions for those who can stay after the hour.
And there is one question that was asked, I think is parallel to some of the stuff that's been talked about in the last 10 minutes. So I just want to run it past the panel, and feel free to jump in, any of you in the panel that feel that this is relevant to you. How do we balance the need for engagement and autonomy with the need for deep thinking and rigor?
I guess that's a stumper.
Well, I feel like Devki touched on it when she mentioned, preferring maybe the applied skill portion of courses or the curriculum versus the lecture, but recognizing it kind of needs to be there. It's not exactly the same thing, but I think it does touch on the idea of, how much do we need to go deep versus being able to jump in and apply.
Yeah, I think that this is the challenge sort of facing education at all levels right now? How do we sort of find that balance? And I posted a comment, and I think it relates to a lot of what we're talking about. To me, the crux, and where I hope that as we're educating students for their lives and their professional lives, we're helping to discern the difference between information and sort of the access and acquisition of information, and how information doesn't equate to knowledge and deeper understanding. And I think it's through those deeper dives of interpretation of information that you help develop these thinking skills that relates to soft skills, but also relates to sort of the professional workplace skills.
You know, I sometimes get students who come in and they're distressed because we didn't teach them a particular piece of software, or, you know, a particular technique. And I always, you know, try to encourage them and tell them, look, you know, your company you go to work for is going to give you the training you need to do your job. And so I think sometimes we need to communicate to students better that the importance of that, you know, you're going to have opportunities to learn these specific skills when you get on the job. The one thing that is important to develop, you know, that we've touched on a few times, are the soft skills, and experiential learning is a great place to develop those. You know, companies, some of our corporate partners have told us, you know, we hire for attitude and potential and motivation, not necessarily for the skills that somebody has.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think as learning designers, whether we're faculty members or instructional designers in a corporate environment, is challenging ourselves to get away, well, to evolve maybe beyond the kind of the purest view of education and pedagogy. And while there is science to it, is to recognize that, as Rachel said, to understand the mix of it, right, and the balance of it is really important, and that not everything requires a deep learning experience or application-based kind of learning experience. I think we need to figure out where we want to focus those types of experiences and really be selective, and really look at other models around curation and aggregation and information discernment in other areas.
And I'm biased, but I'm always happy to talk about why experiential learning is the solution to every problem. But I do think it is the bridge between theory and knowledge, and then what you're saying, Rachel, and everyone, and understanding and adaptation. And it forces us, anyone who does it, to say, well, what does this mean? And then what does it mean in this context? And how do I apply that?
I'm sorry, I completely agree. And I think one of the things that is incredibly inspiring about this particular generation we're talking about is that, in fact, they do seem to recognize, data suggests that they recognize that intersection of information and knowledge and sort of what we at BU kind of refer to as habits of the mind. This is something that does appeal to them. This is something where they see the need and the interest. They're not as tactical, perhaps, as generations that preceded them.
Yeah, and I just wanted to jump in super quickly and say that I definitely think like students are seeking these experiences, and what happens a lot, I think, at the undergraduate level is there are clubs and organizations on campus made with students and some faculty sponsors that dive more into that application side of things. So I'm involved in a few clubs where you take what you've learned in school and you apply it either in a consulting sense or entrepreneurial sense, but there's only so much capacity for those organizations to take in students. So it might be, 100 students out of your class or 50 students out of your class who are getting those experiences. But if that hands-on application can be brought to the classroom, then everyone would have the opportunity to take part in that, not just those maybe who are available after school or after their classes, but everyone who's at the university would be able to apply those skills in class and gain those soft skills before going into the workforce. So that's just a consideration, is that there are some smaller platforms that are trying to add this experience for students, but it's not necessarily reaching everyone right now.
Let me throw in this question. We've still got a lot of people here online. I think we've got another 5 minutes or so that the panelists can stay on. So there's a question about liberal arts and the value of liberal arts. And, I live kind of in our business school, and we've got Robert from engineering. this is a conversation about the value of a liberal arts degree, and what does that mean for the workplace. I know that some schools have tried to integrate liberal arts with business or with engineering. So you're taking philosophy class as a part of one of your business classes, for example. And how would Aristotle think about this accounting problem, right? But I'm curious, Samir, from a workplace, from an employer standpoint, what is the value of a liberal arts degree? And then maybe for all of us, are there ways does it have to be this degree versus that degree, or are there ways to integrate kind of the best of all of those worlds or all of those degrees?
Yeah, I hate to give the typical kind of corporate response of it depends, but it probably does, right? I mean, there are certain fields where you do need the technical skills, right? I mean, it's like if you are operating a certain piece of machinery or, I mean, you have to learn that, right, in order to be able to do it. So I don't want to minimize the need for very specific skills. Engineering is a great example of that. I mean, sometimes you just need to know the skills necessary to the design properties of different materials, right, or chemicals. I think what's really interesting is that as people then work in more cross-functional teams and become leaders, like corporations are really challenged with, like, I continue to encounter this. I encountered in Northwestern University as I talk with some of my peers at other organizations, like what got you here won't get you there. And that, as a leader, you might have deep skills in the work you're working in, but that doesn't necessarily make you a good leader. So why is it that we feel like there's this all of a sudden this point where people, light bulbs go off and they can lead others or work effectively with others, and we expect it to happen, or they can attend some training and make it happen. So I think we need to think of in higher ed the kind of liberal arts side, whether it's formally majoring in it or being part of the curriculum, as applying to how we relate to, connect with, work with others, and understand context in order to apply to the content. I don't know what that looks like exactly, but I think that's so important across a career, not just the job that the person comes out with as the first thing they do.
Those are great comments. I'm going to, we still got a lot of people on here, and we could go a lot longer.
Well, Andrew, actually, before we wrap up, there's a question on here that I think it might be interesting to get your perspective on. And with your background, having just been through a curricular redesign around experiential. So if it's all right, I think it could be interesting to get your feedback on this. It's from a fellow Gen Z from University of Pittsburgh. So that's how the question opens. At what point does experiential learning become a mandatory function of the classroom? Are there general bits of info that need to be learned first through lecture, or can these be achieved by nose diving straight into hands-on work? And I would only add to that, we do increasingly come in contact with schools that put freshmen and sophomores into live projects. I don't know that I ever ran into that 5 years ago when we first started EduSourced. So there may be a trend. I don't have enough insight here to say for sure, but there may be a trend toward getting people into hands-on work early. But Andrew, at Illinois, you guys have launched a project-based learning course at the junior year and not the senior year. So could you talk on that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. First, on the kind of mandatory part of that question, I think in the past 10 years, 15 years, a lot of business schools, MBA programs especially, most of them have some kind of practicum or consulting class. And you see that a lot more now in the undergrad business side and engineering. Engineering has done this a long time, I think, on the design side. What the attitude traditionally has been is experiential learning is a class, and if you want to do experiential learning, take that class and look for it on the list of classes and sign up for that one. I think what's changing is people are seeing the value of learning by doing as a mechanism, as a vehicle, not just a class. And so the sweet spot, I think, is to have a little bit of both. You might have some classes that are practicum or project-based, that the entire class is that project. But what we're seeing here, especially, we're having faculty come to our office and say, hey, I've got this class that I want to make it more hands-on. What ideas do you have? And I see that a lot more. A lot of faculty are saying, I don't want to revamp my entire class. I still have to teach we still have to do a deep dive on this topic, but how could I make this a little more hands-on? I think the sweet spot is closer to that, a combination. As far as early on, or when is a student prepared to do this, that is a question you get in faculty committees, and rightly so. There's accreditation standards, and there's reputation if you have students working with external companies or nonprofits. You have to consider all that. My personal stance is learning by doing is what creates curiosity and leads to more learning. And so the earlier the better, because as soon as you get into the real world, if that's the way to say it, then you start to ask the questions of why does it work this way? Why does the water turn green when you put in this chemical? Or why does it happen this way? And that leads to more learning, versus if you wait until the very end, it's still good, but you've lost out on a lot of learning opportunities for the students. So I think earlier the better, because then students go to other classes with a lot more questions that leads to deeper learning. I think also, one thing we focus on is helping students have a story to tell to employers and parents and whoever they're talking to about their experience. And so if you wait until the last 10 weeks of the 4-year experience, there's not a lot of people to tell your story to. Hopefully you already have a job or an internship. So it brings more value to the student from a career readiness standpoint if you can do that earlier on. So let's just do a final lightning round response, and then we'll close this out. Thank you again for everyone for joining. I'm going to ask the panelists, what's one piece of advice you have, and you can pick your audience, the employer or the academic institution. One piece of advice relevant to this discussion. We'll just go around. Let's start with you, Robert.
For the academics, I think is the best piece of advice I could give is we have to be careful not to teach the way we were taught, and to remember that our experience, especially those of us who have spent our career or a portion of a career at the university, may not be typical of most students. I think we need to take a step back and not just repeat the way we were taught, but think about are there better ways to do it.
Fantastic. Devki?
Yeah, I don't have much on the side of advice, but I would say if you're ever in doubt as an instructor, just ask your students. Maybe just open a survey and say, how would you prefer to maybe ingest this information? And if it aligns with the type of class you're teaching, then maybe add that in. I've been in classes before where halfway through the semester, the professor did that, and then the second half of the semester was just much better of a learning experience than the first half, and it just took a quick 5-minute survey.
It's fantastic advice. Samir?
It's good advice in general, Devki, even for leaders in the corporate world. If you're not sure, ask your team. I would say in both environments, like try things, try stuff. Like the risk, the downside is pretty light. I mean, students are going to figure it out and they're going to learn through whatever mechanisms they can. And so, yeah, we're willing to try things that are different, along with what Robert said. My guess is that Andrew, Robert, Rachel, my colleagues, they try things, and then if it doesn't work, you try something else. And through that refinement, we'll make transformation happen one experiment at a time.
Great advice. Last one for you, Rachel.
I wholeheartedly agree with everything that's said, so I'll toss in something else. I think in all environments, and I'll focus on the workplace, it's important to examine our presumptions and perceptions. I think all too often we think about how are we incorporating this newest generation. It's not about the one coming in, it's actually about how do we integrate across all generations. So we need to understand our own characteristics as well as the characteristics of the newest generation on the forefront.
Fantastic. And David, I'll ask you as well. You work with dozens of universities. You've been doing this for years. Some closing thoughts.
Yeah, I think it just goes back to my comments at the beginning, which is to be open to learning from schools. Let me couch this very specific to project-based learning, which I guess is kind of what we're talking about. But to be open to learning from schools beyond just the schools you would normally benchmark with, because I think that's needlessly limited. Project-based learning, as I said earlier, operationally, I really do believe is very consistent actually from school to school. So joining a community like this and being able to share your insights might be valuable to a school that you might not have considered. You know, Robert and Andrew, I think both learned something from each other. It sounds like we all met in person, but yet one represents a business school, one represents an engineering program. And I get feedback sometimes from schools with the thought of, we don't want to engage with any external partners to support experiential learning. We kind of want to do everything in-house. And so I think that might reflect on, talking with other schools or working with a company like EduSourced. And so I think there's probably a lot more to be accomplished if schools do actually come together. And rather than thinking of it as in-house or not in-house, it's, can we leverage our community of employers to bring in great learning experiences, and what tools and resources and what community touch points do we need to do that? I think is maybe a better way to look at it. Just my perspective, but we've been working with schools for years, and that seems to be a really good recipe for success.
Well, I thank you all to the panelists. You've been fantastic. It's been a lot of years of preparation for this topic. It's been fun for me to get to know you all. And thank you again, everyone who joined today. We'll share the recording and we'll be in touch. Have a great day, everyone.